You are listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, I had the opportunity to interview Lâle Davidson. Lâle is a community college instructor, a climate change activist, and the author of multiple books, including Against the Grain, Blue Woman Burning, and Beyond Sight. I'm here with Lâle Davidson, who is the author of multiple books and a climate change activist and a community college teacher. Lâle, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Hi, so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, my name is Lâle Davidson, and as you just said, and I've written 3 novels and a book of short stories. I've written all my life. And I tend to write in the genre of magic realism, or as it's also called, fabulism, which is not quite fantasy. It's kind of where reality, kind of different cultures come together. So where reality and you write in the realism mode and surreal things happen. Although my latest book is probably straight up fantasy, Beyond Sight, which is a ghost. It's a ghost novel. Set in Saratoga Springs, which is where I live. And it's about a young woman who's suppressed her supernatural powers. She has this ability to feel and see people's energies. And her father has vanished and her mother won't talk about it. But she becomes attracted to this enigmatic fellow, Damian Quinn. They have this connection. And when they explore what seems to be a haunted house, he becomes possessed. And then she has to uncover her and hone her supernatural skills to save him.
Without spoiling too much of your books, how many books have you written and what are each of them about?
So the first one, Blue Woman Burning, so I've written 3 novels and a book of short stories. The first one, Blue Woman Burning, is my most kind of magical realist piece. And I'll just read you the description. In the cold descending breeze of the Altiplano between Chile and Bolivia, Fallon's narcissistic mother bursts into flames before her family's eyes. The inexplicable nature of their loss marks each family member in a different way. For Fallon, it's the first step towards adulthood. And for her older brother, it's a blow that he never recovers from. 13 years later, Fallon is about to conquer her self-doubt and apply for medical school when another calamity sends her reeling and precipitates a cross-country trip in search of a truth worth living for. What she discovers changes everything. So that's the first novel, a semi-autobiographical. Of course, my mother did not spontaneously combust. And then the second one you mentioned is I call it an environmental thriller with a mystical twist. And it's based on the true story of activists trying to save the old growth redwoods in California, often through kind of like the Monkey Wrench Gang, by disabling the bulldozers and occupying trees, living in trees so they can't be cut down. And it kind of came to a climax in 1990 during Redwood Summer. And it's the event around which Richard Powers' book, The Overstory, is centered on as well. But in mine, the trees communicate. There are chapters where you hear directly from the trees. And I'm proud of that feat. I think I pulled it off realistically. And then the third novel I just talked about, the supernatural novel.
Now, are all your books self-published, all your books traditionally published, or are some self-published and others traditionally published?
They're all traditionally published, but by an independent publisher called Red Penguin Books. Stephanie Larkin is the head penguin, the penguin in chief. And so it's a traditional contract, but it's not, one of the big 5.
Yeah, not to be confused with Penguin Random House, which is a big 5 traditional publisher.
Exactly, right. This is an independent publisher. Yeah. So I'm glad to be part of that independent movement, which has really been taking the world by storm. And wresting back some of the market to to regular writers. I wouldn't call myself a regular writer, but writers who for one reason or another couldn't make it through the kind of very small eye of the needle to the agent that gives you access to the big five.
Now, how is ADHD both a hindrance and an aid in creative writing? And I ask this because this was in your pod match questions, and I have an autism spectrum disorder.
Oh, interesting. Yes, and sometimes they kind of have they cross over, right? Sometimes ADHD is comes along with a little bit of autism and vice versa. Is that right?
Yeah, I have a lot of traits that are commonly associated with people with ADHD, even though my diagnosis is autism spectrum disorder and a lot of what comes with that.
Yes. I sort of hate the term disorder because, it implies that it's a disorder when it's really just a different order, that it has its strengths and weaknesses, just like quote unquote normal people. But to answer your question, so ADHD, I didn't even know I had ADHD until I was diagnosed late in life in my 50s. And once I was diagnosed with that, it made complete sense because I never understood time. Time was always a matter of confusion for me. It seems it to expand and contract. And of course, we all know scientifically time is a human construct. But anyway, the way that it helps is that I think ADHD people tend to be very creative because, again, attention deficit disorder, I think, is a misnomer. It's not that we can't pay attention. It's that we pay too much attention to everything and we have trouble filtering things out. So what that means is you have a mind that kind of darts around because if somebody's talking to you and a bird starts chirping, you hear the bird chirping. And then if your feet itch, you feel your feet itching. And because you're paying attention to everything, sometimes it's hard to absorb the person talking. It is also a developmental quote unquote disorder, meaning that you can train your mind. The mind continues to be plastic and trainable throughout your entire life. And my ability to focus has gotten much better over time. So I find now that I'm able to think more flexibly than some people because I'm able to jump around so fast. So what I tell my students in class is that yes, there's a certain amount of training that you have to do where you have to take your attention and pull it back to the person talking. But a better way, I think, to handle ADHD is to think of it like a horse. You don't want to tie the horse to the wall all the time. You want to get on that horse and ride and find out where it's going. Because often as the mind is darting away from the speaker, it's darting away to make an interesting connection. And if you can track that, and this is what I have found to be the case, you will find that you have very interesting and in-depth ideas. So, for example, if I'm reading a book, it takes me a lot longer to read a book because my mind is moving to other things. So it may take me longer to read a chapter than somebody whose mind doesn't do that. But at the end of the chapter, I will have, 5 interesting connections that I can make between that reading and something else.
Now, okay, oh yeah, you went on so long. I actually forgot what my next question. But now
I'm so sorry.
Now I'm found my place, so it's okay. What is your best advice you could give to someone who is seeking to overcome writer's block?
First is be okay with writing it down badly. It's so essential that you have to allow that first draft to be bad and to be disorganized. That would be number one. I would say number two is lower the stress around it, lower the expectations. And there's a variety of ways to do that. But the first would be you maybe set a timer and write for 10 minutes, trying not to pay attention, like trying to turn off the critic's voice and just ramble. And then, write for the entire 10 minutes, then take a break, walk away, come back, reread it, and start doodling with it. So there's a lot of techniques, but that would be number one is allow yourself to write badly. And number two is lower the stakes, the writing stakes.
Now, I'm going to ask a couple of very tough questions about a couple of your books. The first one is, now you said earlier your mother did not spontaneously combust in real life. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
that is correct.
But regarding Blue Woman Burning, how do you handle the potential betrayal of family and friends when you write about them?
That's a really good question. I did have to run it by my siblings ahead of time. And I had to say to them, though you may recognize that some attributes of yourself in these characters, please keep in mind that this is fiction, that there's no way I can capture you on the page because you are, vaster than a novel. And that I changed events to make the story better. So the scariest part of that book for me, and I don't want to do a spoiler thing, but something happens to the brother. So I won't tell you what it is. But the scary thing was that, that character is based very loosely on my brother, who I'm very close to. And I didn't want him to think that I wanted that terrible thing to happen to him. So the way I put it to him is, typically what a writer does is they create characters they love, and then they say, what's the worst thing that I could do to this character, that could happen to this character? Because that makes a good story. So in other words, this is not wish fulfillment. I don't wish this bad thing to happen to you. It's the thing I fear most. And in a way, it was a way of kind of, getting rid of the ghosts for me. By writing it down, I was hoping that it would not happen in reality.
Now, you are a climate change activist, and in Against the Grain, you write about tree sitters and tree spikers. Does your novel condone violence?
Thank you for asking that question. No, not at all. I do recognize that, the climate change is threatening humanity, and the quality of our lives. And so very much is at stake, but and that, the truth of the matter is that what fossil fuels have done to our environment is a violence that will cause the death of hundreds of thousands of people, and already is. So, but nevertheless, I don't think violence is the answer. I think understanding and collaboration is the answer. That's how we will get through. And studies show that people do better, animals do better when they collaborate and help each other than when they compete against each other and try to defeat each other. So one of the main characters of Against the Grain, Logan, he does some things that I would consider bad, and he considers them bad. At a certain point in the novel, he said he has to come to terms with himself and go, he doesn't recognize himself. He's turned into this violent being, and he has to address that.
Why is it important to write even if one can't make a living from it?
Thank you for asking that question. Art, I think, is terribly important to the human soul. So I think that whether you get published or whether other people think you're good is really besides the point. The purpose of art is to connect with something larger than yourself, to kind of to travel. The unconscious mind is brilliant, and things happen when you spend a lot of time in that realm. You access parts of your brain that maybe you don't have access to in everyday life. And so I think it's part of helping us achieve our potential, but I think it's also how we connect to our humanity and how we connect to others more deeply. So I find that whether I make any money on my books at all, the most valuable thing that I get from writing is the writing groups, that I have a writing group and when we meet, the quality of interaction, of human discussion, of relationships is very high because we're talking about these things that matter to us so much. I would go to a writing group any day over a party. I have a lot more fun there.
Now, you've been teaching at a community college for 3 decades or so, maybe a little bit longer than that. What are some of the most important things that experience as a community college instructor taught you?
Oh, that's a big question. One of the things that I learned, I mean, I think I always knew it, but it's different when you learn it on a day-to-day basis, is that poverty compounds all your problems. So my students are often challenged by their first challenge is, not having enough money. So it makes everything harder. It means you're driving a car that doesn't work very well. And when it breaks down, you can't get to your job. And when you can't get to your job, you can't pay your bills. When you can't pay your bills, you're all kinds of other things happen. So poverty really is the big exacerbator. So that's been a big lesson for me that stress and poverty make it hard to learn. And I think that my compassion has only grown over the years by teaching people who are really struggling to make themselves better against incredible odds.
Lally, that was my final question, and I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast.
Thank you for having me again.
Lally was an amazing guest to interview. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.